If you've ever whispered a prayer over bills you were ashamed to lay out in front of your own family, stay with me for this one. And if your people ever fought hard to keep a piece of land that still slipped away, tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. Because on a gray September morning in Benton County, Iowa, the first yellow auction tag went onto a 1997 John Deere 7810. And by noon the Mercer family was loaning something that never shows up on a bank statement. The note was on paper. The cost was not. From the road, the place still looked like the kind of farm people trust. White farmhouse with the paint going soft around the windows. A red barn older than any of the men standing near it. 2 grain bins behind the machine shed. A stand of cottonwoods leaning toward the creek. The sort of yard where generations have been photographed in chore coats, Easter clothes, seed caps, and funeral black. But the farm was already gone before the first bidder lifted a hand. The bank had taken it 6 weeks earlier in a sheriff's sale that happened under fluorescent lights in town, with legal descriptions read faster than grief can hear. What remained now was the public part, the visible part, the part where neighbors walked through the gravel lot holding coffee cups and pretending not to look too closely at the tools, the wagons, the box of chains, the freezer, the porch glider, the press-back years of a family life that had to be numbered and sold. By the end of that day, people would say the Mercers lost a farm. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. What they really lost was slower than that. It had started years earlier with a funeral, an inheritance promise, 2 bad weather seasons, a bank renewal meeting that went cold, and the kind of family silence that lets trouble grow roots. If you only saw the auction, you might think the bank took the land because the family failed. That isn't how it happened. The farm was taken by a stack of ordinary decisions that each made sense for about 15 minutes. And the auction? The auction was just the day everybody could finally see the damage. To understand why the bank took this Iowa family farm, you have to go back to when the land was still whole. The family still ate together on Sundays, and nobody at that kitchen table yet believed a Blue Note folder could outlast blood. The Mercer place sat outside Keystone, Iowa, on 320 owned acres of black dirt and creek-bottom ground that had been in the family since 1949, when Calvin Mercer's father came back for post-war factory work in Waterloo and bought the original 160 with money he'd saved and money he borrowed so carefully he paid the note off 5 years early just to sleep better. By the time this story begins, Calvin Mercer was 62 years old and built like a man who had spent his whole life lifting what should have taken 2 people. He didn't talk much at the coffee shop in town, didn't trust easy talk from crop salesmen, and still kept grease pencils in his shirt pocket because that was what his father had done. He believed machinery ought to be cleaned before it was parked, bills ought to be open the day they arrived, and if a fence needed fixing, you fixed it before supper. His wife, June, kept the books in a ruled ledger even after the farm software salesman told her twice that nobody serious still did it that way. She made notes in the margin in small, neat writing. Diesel paid, seed deferred, vet bill due Friday, church supper next Wednesday, Claire bringing Noah after school. If Calvin carried the farm in his shoulders, June carried it in columns. Their son, Ben, was 34 and had come home after community college because he wanted the thing his friends were leaving, not just work, but continuity. He liked yield maps, market podcasts, variable rate prescriptions, and the idea that a family farm could still survive if it got smarter, tighter, faster. He wasn't reckless, not really, but he was less afraid of debt than his father was, and more afraid of standing still. Their daughter, Claire Holloway, lived in Vinton and worked as a school secretary. She had married a mechanic named Travis, had one 8-year-old boy named Noah, and still came back often enough that her coffee mug stayed in the Mercer cupboard over the sink. Claire loved the farm the way off-farm children often do, fiercely, sentimentally, and from a distance just far enough away to avoid seeing every balance sheet. The farm itself was a mixed, shrinking version of what many Iowa places had become. Corn and soybeans in rotation. An old machine shed with repairs layered over repairs. A red International 1066, still used for auger work and short poles, because Calvin said if a tractor had already proved itself for 40 years, it deserved one more season. A Kins planter with enough weld marks to tell its own family history. A gravity wagon bin swore they needed to replace. 2 grain bins. 1 creek. 1 farmhouse that held too many memory anchors to ever be priced correctly by anybody outside the family. Sunday rhythms still existed there. Not perfectly, but enough to matter. June went to the small Methodist church near Blairstown more faithfully than the men did. Calvin went when funerals, Christmas, Easter, or guilt carried him there. Ben showed up in work boots and sat in the back if he had chores waiting. Nobody on that farm talked in big religious language, but there was still a habit of bowing heads before supper, still a Bible on the hall table, still an old understanding that hard years made people either softer or meaner, and they were trying, quietly, not to become mean. In late summer, before everything went wrong in public, the place still sounded like a working farm. Dry beans rattling in a coffee can. Air compressor kicking on in the shed. Cicadas in the cottonwoods. A truck door slamming at first light. The whine of an unload auger. June calling from the porch that supper would be cold if they let it. And if you had driven past then, you might have thought what people always think when a place still looks intact. They'll find a way. Most families do not fall apart in one dramatic moment. Most families look steady right up until the week they don't. The trouble that took the Mercer farm did not begin with one foolish purchase or one cruel banker or one bad harvest. It began in March of 2018 at June Mercer's mother's funeral. June's mother, Evelyn Rusk, had owned the South 80 adjoining the home place. It had always been understood, at least in the loose, dangerous way family things are understood, that the ground would stay with the farm. But wills turned family sayings into paperwork, and paperwork demands numbers where memory prefers feelings. Evelyn's will divided the South 80 equally between June and her brother, Wayne, who had lived in Cedar Rapids for 25 years and did not farm. Wayne didn't want the land. He wanted his share of its value, and he was not wrong for that. He had a laid-off son, a wife with health trouble, and his own bills. The problem was that what sounded fair in an attorney's office sounded impossible at a farm kitchen table. To keep the South 80 attached to the Mercer operation, Calvin and June borrowed against the home place and signed a term note to buy Wayne out. Ben supported it. Claire supported it. Everybody told themselves the same thing. Land next door almost never comes for sale twice, and if they let it split off, they'd regret it forever. For about 15 minutes, it felt like the right decision. Then came 2019. That spring was so wet in eastern Iowa that low spots looked like they had decided to become permanent water. Planting windows opened and shut like trapdoors. Ben mudded in some acres he should have left alone. Calvin said so. Ben said if they waited any longer, they wouldn't get a stand worth looking at. They planted, then they replanted. Prevented planting coverage softened the blow, but only on paper. Cash flow does not respect technical explanations. In 2020, the derecho tore across Iowa, and while the Mercers were west of the worst damage, they still lost in sheets, part of a machine shed roof, and enough flat corn to turn harvest into a slow, ugly salvage job. The crop came in wet. Drying costs climbed. Repairs stacked up. Insurance helped, but insurance never restores time, only invoices. Then fertilizer surged. Diesel followed. Parts got slower to find and faster to price. In 2021 and 2022, Ben made the case that if they were going to survive, they had to spread fixed costs across more acres. He found 140 rented acres from a retiring neighbor and pushed to take them. He also pushed for a used self-propelled sprayer so they could stop paying retail application costs and tighten timing. He ran spreadsheets. He talked about efficiencies, field speed, custom work on the side. He was not dreaming of some giant empire. He was trying to make room for himself in a business that no longer left much room for a second generation. Calvin resisted, then gave in halfway, which is often the most expensive way to lose an argument. They took the rented ground. They financed the sprayer. They increased the operating line. The farm got bigger on paper. It did not get easier. Then June got sick. In October of 2023, after putting off her own appointment twice because harvest was near, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was treatable. It was not immediately catastrophic, but treatment has a way of changing the gravity inside a house. Days that used to belong to field work started belonging to appointments in Cedar Rapids. Calvin drove more. Ben covered more. Claire came down more often. Meals got simpler. Tempers got shorter. The ledger in June's handwriting kept going, but the entries grew less confident, as though even the numbers could feel her fatigue. By the winter of 2024, 3 separate things were true at once. The Mercers still had good land. They still knew how to farm, and they were no longer generating enough clean cash to satisfy the kind of bank review that arrives after 3 hard years in a row. That was the part outsiders missed. A family farm does not have to be lazy, foolish, or wasteful to become vulnerable. Sometimes it just has to be leveraged at the wrong moment while life keeps happening. By the time the operating note came up for renewal in January, the Mercers were carrying the inherited land note, machinery debt, medical bills on payment plans, and an operating line that had gotten too used to carrying losses forward. The blue folder from the bank had started living on the corner of June's kitchen table. Nobody moved it. Nobody wanted to be the one to open it first. And that is usually how a note starts changing from a farm tool into a family ghost. The first time June said out loud that they might lose the farm, it was not in church. It was in the kitchen after one of her treatment days, when the house was finally quiet and Calvin had gone out to shut the machine shed because he needed something with hinges and steel to put his hands on. Ben was standing at the sink, drinking water straight from a jelly jar. Claire was at the table, sorting envelopes into piles nobody wanted named. June lowered herself into her chair slowly, like even sitting down had become work, and rested her hand over the blue folder. "I need the truth in this room," she said. No one answered, so she gave it to them anyway. "We are not behind in the way we used to get behind," she said. "We are behind in the way people stop catching up from." The room went still. Outside, the yard light buzzed. The refrigerator clicked on. Somebody's dog barked down the road. Claire asked the question Calvin and Ben had both been ducking. "How bad?" June looked at the ledger, then at her son, then at her husband when he came back in and stopped in the doorway, because he could tell from the silence that the conversation had started without him. "Bad enough," she said, "that if this next meeting goes the wrong way, the bank is going to tell us to sell land." Calvin pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. Ben stared at the sink. And June, who was the least dramatic person in that family, did something so small it might not have looked like anything to anybody outside the house. She bowed her head over cold coffee and said, "Lord, don't let debt turn us against each other." That was all. No sermon, no verse, no promise that everything would work out. Just one tired sentence from a tired woman asking for something more realistic than rescue. Not save the acres, not multiply the money. Just don't let this make us cruel. If your family has ever sat around a table trying to decide what to sell first, you know exactly how holy that kind of prayer can feel. Ben finally spoke. "We can still fix it." Calvin answered too fast. "With what?" "With one good crop. With cash rent cut. With custom work. With a better grain sale than we had last year. With me taking more off-farm work if I have to." Calvin laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "That's not fixing. That's breathing through a leak." Claire said maybe they should consider selling the South 80 before the bank forced worse terms. The minute the words left her mouth, Ben's face changed. "That's easy for you to say," he said. Claire looked up slowly. "I didn't say it easy. You said it from town." June shut her eyes. There it was. The first crack spoken clearly enough for everybody to hear. Not just fear of losing land. Fear of who got to speak for it. That night Calvin did go to church, but there was no service. He drove the pickup out to the gravel lot and sat there in the dark with the engine off, looking at the fellowship hall windows reflecting nothing. He had done this before in hard seasons. Not often, just enough that the road there felt familiar when the rest of life didn't. He did not ask God for a miracle. He asked, in a voice nobody heard, for one clean chance to make the numbers honest again. What he got instead was a bank meeting, and that meeting would do more damage than the weather ever had. The renewal meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in late January at Heartland Agricultural Bank in Benton, the kind of building designed to look sturdy without feeling personal. Brick front, clean glass, framed aerial photos of farmland in the lobby, a bowl of peppermint candies no farmer over 50 ever touched. For years, the Mercers had dealt with a lender named Ron Becker, who knew the ground, knew Calvin's father, knew which pieces ran wet, and understood that farm families often needed time more than lectures. But Heartland had merged with a larger holding company the previous fall, and Ron had retired 2 months early. Now the meeting belonged to a younger AG officer named Eric Halverson and a credit vice president dialing in from Cedar Rapids. That mattered, because a local banker can still see a family. A remote credit committee sees exposure. Eric spread out the paperwork with practiced care. June had brought the ledger. Ben had brought printed yield maps and a cash flow projection. Calvin had brought his seed cap and his temper, though only one of those was visible at first. Eric did not sound cruel. That is worth saying. He sounded careful. He explained that the operating line, the estate-related term note on the South 80, and the equipment note were cross-collateralized. He explained that the farm had shown 3 consecutive years of weak repayment capacity. He explained that carryover debt had become structural rather than seasonal. He explained that the committee would require a curtailment of $92,000 before renewal and wanted additional collateral released through a voluntary sale of the South 80 or the North Creek tract. Ben pushed his projections across the table. Better yields, reduced family draw, off-farm income, custom spraying, a landlord rent concession he thought he could negotiate. The credit vice president on speakerphone asked how much of the projection depended on corn above current local cash price. Ben stopped talking for a second. That was answer enough. June asked if the bank would stretch amortization and separate the estate note from the operating line. Eric said they had reviewed that possibility. The voice on speakerphone said the family's global debt structure no longer supported it. Calvin asked a question every farmer in that position eventually asks. So what are you telling me? Eric folded his hands. I'm telling you the bank will renew only with significant principal reduction, asset liquidation, and a written plan that reduces overall leverage before spring. And if we don't, the speakerphone answered this time, then the note will not be renewed under current terms. That was banker language. Accurate, clean, bloodless. What meant was simpler. Pay down something big, fast, or the machinery that made spring possible would become collateral in trouble, and the land behind it would stop feeling safe. On the drive home, nobody said much until they passed the co-op and turned south. Then Ben started. If we sell the South 80, we can stabilize. Calvin stared through the windshield. No, it is one tract. No, it is not the home place. It is Mercer ground. It is Mercer ground we borrowed against a buy from Uncle Wayne in the first place. We used debt to keep it. Now the debt is killing the rest. Calvin's jaw tightened. You think I don't know that? Ben kept going because fear makes people stupid in a very honest way. I think you'd rather lose everything whole than cut off one part and survive. June said his name once, quietly, but it was too late. At home, Claire was already there, having guessed from June's text that the meeting had gone badly. They laid the papers on the kitchen table. Eric's summary: required curtailment, renewal conditions, cash flow stress language, voluntary liquidation alternatives. Claire read faster than the men. So the bank's giving you a choice, she said. Calvin turned on her harder than he meant to. No, the bank is giving us the shape of our surrender. The next 3 weeks were full of half measures that would have saved a family in shallower water. They listed the sprayer. They sold a stock trailer. Ben picked up overnight maintenance shifts at an ethanol plant twice a week. June cashed a certificate of deposit she had never told the men she still had. A landlord shaved some rent. The Mercers managed to raise money, just not $92,000 of it. By mid-February, the bank sent formal notice. Default, acceleration, failure to cure, possible foreclosure proceedings if voluntary terms were not accepted. June read the letter twice. Calvin once. Ben not at all. He just asked what it said, though he already knew. The paper itself didn't shout, but everything in that house did after that. Not loud. Worse. Quiet. The first real family blow-up happened on a Sunday that should have been ordinary. June had made roast beef because Claire and Noah were coming after church. Ben came in late from checking a rented field and tracked half the driveway into the mudroom. Calvin was already mad about that, though it had nothing to do with what was really wrong. Claire came carrying a pie she should not have bothered making, and Noah went straight to the living room floor with a toy grain truck he always left there between visits. For 10 minutes, they almost looked like themselves. Then Claire asked whether they had met with an attorney about protecting whatever equity might remain if the foreclosure moved forward. Ben put his fork down. Calvin stared at his plate. June knew instantly where it was headed. Claire tried to explain. She was not circling money for herself. She was trying to keep the fallout from becoming bigger than it already was. But truth in families is less about intent than timing, and she had spoken too close to the wound. Ben said, "You keep talking like this is already over." Claire said, "I'm talking like pretending hasn't helped." Ben said, "Easy to say when your paycheck doesn't come from this yard." Claire said, "My paycheck also doesn't come from pretending Dad can be a note by glaring at it." That hit Calvin, not Ben. He stood up from the table, so suddenly his chair legs barked on the linoleum. "You think this is pride?" Claire looked at him and, because she was his daughter, made the mistake of answering honestly. "I think part of it is." June whispered, "Claire." But Calvin was already gone past restraint. "I borrowed to keep family land together. I borrowed because all of you said the same thing then, that we couldn't let it leave the farm. Now that it costs something, suddenly I'm the stubborn old man." Ben stood too, because sons have a way of rising when fathers rise. "It isn't just the buyout note," he said, "and you know it." That was the second crack. Claire looked from one man to the other. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered for too long. Then June did. "It means the sprayer repair last fall went on vendor financing." Ben turned toward her. "I was going to tell them." "When?" Calvin asked. "After planting? After default? After the auctioneer was in the yard?" Ben's face went red, not with guilt alone, but with exhaustion. It was $19,000. The pump, the boom controls, labor. I needed it running. We were already short. I thought I could cover it with custom work. "You thought," Calvin said. "With whose land under it?" There are moments in family stories where the real damage is not the money. It is the rearrangement of trust. Claire sat back down slowly because Noah was in the other room and she did not want him hearing the sharpest parts. June pressed her hand flat on the table like she was trying to hold the house steady. "If you had to choose," Claire said finally, looking at both men, "would you save the land or save the family?" No one answered, and that silence was the truest answer in the room, because by then the Mercers were trapped inside the oldest rural lie there is, that if the land goes, everything goes with it, and if the land stays, maybe all the rest can be repaired later. But later is expensive. Later is how people lose each other while saying they're trying to hold everything together. That afternoon, Claire left before dark. She kissed June. She hugged Noah into his coat. She told Calvin to call if anything changed. She told Ben nothing. For 2 weeks after that, he did not text her once. June cried only once that night, and only because Calvin saw her in the laundry room and asked what was wrong in a voice so worn out it made everything worse. She said the line she had prayed in the kitchen weeks earlier. I ask God not to let debt turn us against each other." Then she looked at him with the kind of tired clarity that comes after hope has been overworked. "I think it already has." Once foreclosure started feeling real, the Mercers did what farm families always do first. They worked harder. Ben sold the sprayer at a loss. Calvin let go of the 1066 only after sitting in it one last evening with the shed doors open and the dust turning gold in the low sun. June cut household spending down to the bone. The freezer emptied. The cattle that had once helped smooth bad crop years were already gone from the lot, sold off in pieces over the previous 18 months to patch holes that only got larger. A man from church offered to speak with a lawyer he knew in Cedar Rapids. A neighbor offered part-time trucking work for Ben during seed season. 2 women from a Methodist church dropped off casseroles and did not ask numbers, which was the kindest thing anyone had done. Claire came back with folders, legal pads, and more patience than either of the men deserved. For one brief stretch in early March, the farm felt almost united again. Not hopeful, just aligned. The kind of alignment people get when options have become so narrow that arguing takes more energy than agreeing. The attorney told them what the bank already had. Priority, sign notes, cross-default language, enough paper to make fighting expensive and delay more painful than strategy. He also told them something Calvin hated hearing. If you had sold a tract 6 months ago, you might have controlled the loss. That word sat in the room like a smell nobody named. Controlled. Loss. In the same sentence. The bank's final offer came a week later. Consent to the foreclosure process. Cooperate on possession timeline. Avoid drawn-out litigation. In return, there would be no immediate deficiency action beyond the secured liquidation already planned, assuming auction proceeds were applied as agreed. Bank language again. What meant was this: the land was going, and unless values came in better than expected, much of the machinery and stored equipment would go with it. Calvin signed last, not because he misunderstood, because he understood completely. Ben walked out to the machine shed and hit the side of a gravity wagon hard enough to hurt his hand. June found him there and said nothing at first. Then she asked him the question mothers ask when they already know the answer. "Are you angry at your father?" Ben looked down at his split knuckle. "I'm angry at the whole thing. That isn't what I asked." He leaned against the wagon. "I'm angry he wouldn't sell the South 80 when we still had the choice." June nodded once. "Then be honest enough to also say you wanted those extra rented acres and that sprayer." Ben did not defend himself. That was new. "What do we do now?" he asked. June looked toward the house, where Calvin was at the table with the blue folder open for once, not hiding from it anymore, because there was no hiding left to do. "We tell the truth," she said, "and then we survive whatever truth leaves us." There was no miracle turn after that. No surprise investor. No secret will. No neighbor campaign. Just an auction date. September 12th, 10 in the morning. Mercer Family Farm Equipment and Household Liquidation. Online bidding available. That last line was the part Ben hated most, because it meant the people taking pieces of their life would not even have to stand in the yard to do it. Auction mornings have a strange sound to them. Not loud at first, just early. Pickups arriving before sunup. Trailer ramps clanging. Men clearing throats into paper cups of coffee. The cough of diesel engines. Boot heels on gravel. Strangers speaking too casually in a place where memory is heavier than machinery. The auction crew got there before 7. They moved with efficient kindness, which is sometimes harder to bear than coldness. They set up tables, checked lot numbers, hung signs, tested the microphone, and taped the sale order to the trailer wall. The yellow tags were already on everything that mattered. Lot 14, John Deere 7810. Lot 22, Kins 3600 planter. Lot 37, fuel barrel and pump. Lot 61, bench grinder. Lot 88, porch glider. Lot 104, June's freezer. Lot 133, assorted hand tools. When a family life is forced through liquidation, dignity gets broken down into inventory categories. Calvin was dressed before daylight. Seed cap, clean work shirt, jacket he wore to funerals and courthouse visits. June stood at the sink longer than she needed to, hands wrapped around coffee she barely drank. Ben stayed outside because if he came in, he knew he might not go back out again. Claire arrived with Noah just after 8 and immediately realized bringing him had been a mistake. Not because he was loud, because he was quiet enough to understand that all the adults were acting wrong. "Why are there stickers on Grandpa's tractor?" he asked. Claire knelt and told him people were buying things today. He asked, "Are we moving?" She said yes. He asked for how long. That one she could not answer. Neighbors came, some to support, some because auctions are part grief, part commerce, part rural habit. A few stood close to Calvin and spoke softly. Most did not. In farm country, people know when words are too small. At 10 o'clock, the auctioneer climbed onto the trailer and welcomed everyone to the Mercer sale as if he were opening any other retirement dispersal. That hurt Ben more than if the man had sounded solemn, because it was not retirement. It was forced erasure wearing the same format as choice. The small items went first. Tools, shop equipment, chains, battery chargers, fence stretchers, the quick rhythm of nickels, 10s, 20s, hands lifting, voices calling, online bids flashing on the screen near the clerk's table. The crowd warmed to the mechanics of buying before the family warmed at all. Ben watched a man from 20 miles away buy 3 implement tires for less than the cost of one new one. He watched a kid barely older than he'd been when he came home to farm by a seed tender. He watched June's porch glider go to a woman from town who said she had always liked it when driving by. Then came the 1066. The old red tractor had never been the most valuable thing on the place, but it may have been the most Mercer thing. Calvin's father had bought it used in 1981. Ben had learned to steer on it. Claire had ridden its fender in parade lines. It had augured out corn, pulled wagons, started in cold no modern machine should have tolerated. The bidding opened low and climbed slower than Ben expected. That hurt too. You spend a lifetime telling yourself certain things are priceless, and then the market informs you they are merely old. Calvin did not look at the tractor while it sold. He looked at the ground. The 7810 brought decent money. The planter did better. The grain trailer went to an online bidder from Illinois. The shop tools disappeared into boxes and flatbeds. By lunch, the yard was visibly thinner. Empty rectangles appeared where equipment had sat for years. Space began opening inside the machine shed like missing teeth. And then, in the early afternoon, the household lots began. That was when the auction stopped feeling like business and started feeling indecent. Kitchen table and 6 chairs. Canning jars. June's oak china cabinet. A cedar chest. Calvin's father's drill index. Framed prints. Box lots from drawers nobody outside the family had ever opened. Claire stepped away and cried behind the grain bins where nobody could see except Ben, who saw and almost went to her, and then didn't because they still did not know how to stand near each other without feeling accused. The last hard thing was not the tractor. It was the freezer, because inside that freezer, until the week before, had been the ordinary proof of a family life. Sweet corn, hamburger wrapped in white paper, soup stock, church supper leftovers, bread June baked and froze because busy weeks always came. By the time it rolled across the sale ring, it was empty, clean, unplugged, harmless. And that was exactly why it broke June. An empty freezer looks like nothing. But sometimes nothing is the clearest picture of what is gone. If you've ever watched your family hold on to something that was impossible to keep, you know the worst part is not always the biggest item. Sometimes it's the plain object that proves everyday life has already ended. By 4 o'clock, buyers were hauling away the shape of the Mercer's old life in loads and straps and pickup beds. The yard got quieter with every departure. The auctioneer thanked everybody. The clerks boxed paperwork. The online screen went dark. And when it was done, the place did not look robbed. It looked edited, which for some losses is worse. Because theft feels violent. Editing feels final. The Mercers were out of the farmhouse before the first frost. Calvin and June moved into a two-bedroom apartment in Benton over a dental office, the kind of place that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and somebody else's cooking. Ben and his wife, Leah, took a rental outside Shellsburg for a while. Then he started working full-time for a custom application outfit and did enough side trucking to stay busy and tired, which is how many men survive what they cannot explain. Claire helped pack more of the house than either of the men did. Not because she loved it less, because she was the only one who could touch certain things without freezing in place. The land passed fully out of the family by year's end. One tract went to a neighboring operator, another to an investor group with a plain name ending in LLC. The yard was eventually rented with the bins. By spring, the new tenant had painted over the old mailbox lettering. Mercer, gone in one coat. People in town said the family was doing all right, which is what people say when nobody is dead and nobody is publicly falling apart. But what the auction really cost never showed up cleanly enough for town talk. It cost Calvin the place where he understood himself. It cost Ben the idea that work alone can save what blood and memory built. It cost Claire the easy way home. For months, she called before visiting because she no longer knew which version of the family she was driving into. June's prayer from the kitchen had not been answered the way she hoped. Debt had turned them against each other, at least for a while. Not in one dramatic break. In smaller, meaner ways. Delayed calls. Thin voices. Holidays shortened by weather that wasn't weather. Careful subjects. Old arguments living under new conversations. And yet the strangest part was this. Once the farm was gone, the anger lost some of its fuel. There was nothing left to save, which meant there was finally room, though not much, to admit what each person had done and failed to do. Calvin admitted he should have sold land earlier when the choice was still his. Ben admitted expansion had made a narrow operation more fragile than he wanted to believe. Claire admitted she had confused clear thinking with clean distance. Nobody said these things beautifully. This was not that kind of family. But they said enough. One evening in late November, June spread supper on the small apartment table and bowed her head just like she had in the farmhouse. Her voice was soft. Thank you for what's left. No one cried. No one said much. But Ben did stay longer that night. The Mercer farm was gone. The auction had done what it came to do. And the worst ending in stories like this is not always burial, bankruptcy, or some final shouted sentence. Sometimes the worst ending is simpler. The land is gone. The family survives. But never again in the shape it once believed was permanent. The note had been on paper. The cost was not. It was in the Sunday table that no longer fit everybody. It was in the county road Calvin stopped driving. It was in the way Claire still kept her old mug at her mother's apartment because she could not bring herself to call anywhere else home. And it was in Ben, who still slowed down every harvest when he passed the old Mercer ground and saw somebody else's machine unfolding across it under a sky that did not care whose name used to be on the mailbox. Some losses don't arrive all at once. They come in letters, meetings, weather, silence, signatures, and then one public day when everybody can finally see what private strain has already done. That's what happened to the Mercers. The bank took the farm because the numbers failed, but the auction showed what numbers can't measure. If your family has ever faced debt, foreclosure, land loss, inheritance strain, or the long quiet after starting over, tell me in the comments. And if you had to choose, would you fight to save the land, or would you cut it loose sooner to save the family? For some people, faith keeps the farm. For others, faith is just what remains when the farm is gone. Either way, the story still matters. And so do the people who lived it.